Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Deerhunter called Why Hasn't Everything Already Disappeared? So it's been a very long time since I talked about Deerhunter, at least on this channel in a formal review. I discussed Monomania in the very early days of my channel back in 2013, but when it came to Fading Frontier in 2015, I actually teamed up with the Indie Heads podcast to discuss the album at length, and yet somehow I wound up as the guy who was the stick in the mud who really didn't care much at all for the project. And what's frustrating is that whenever I've listened to a Deerhunter album in recent years, I've come away with the understanding of exactly why a lot of critics will just adore this band, and yet it just never clicks for me as well as so many of their peers. Don't get me wrong, there are projects in their back catalog that I've enjoyed, but I would struggle to put any of their albums on a pedestal in any respective year. I mean, Halcyon Digest might get close, but even then it's kind of dicey. And what's exasperating is that it's never just the one thing. The most consistent frustration probably comes at frontman Bradford Cox's improvised song construction and persistently underwhelming nihilism, but when you factor in distinct production and tonal inconsistencies, it leaves me never quite liking or disliking a Deerhunter album in the same way. And coming off of Fading Frontier, look, it's not bad, but revisiting it highlights a lot of the repeated lyrical issues from earlier albums, and the more placid tone and instrumentation it continues to show that brand of mid to late 80s Americana has been done better elsewhere by a lot of acts in recent years. Now that being said, I was kind of curious about this album, as Buzz was suggesting more elaborate instrumentation could make this Deerhunter's answer to the National's High Violet, a comparison of which I was immediately extremely skeptical, because say what you will about the National, Matt Berninger can write cohesive songs, and maybe outside of that last album, they've had consistently great production. But alright, fine. I can appreciate more ambition going in here, so what did we get from Why Hasn't Everything Already Disappeared? Well, okay, first off, any serious music critic who has said this album in the same sentence as The National should have their faculties checked, because High Violet was about the furthest and last comparison that came to my mind. No, upon the first 6 or 7 or so listens to Why Hasn't Everything Already Disappeared, my mind went to, what if Real Estate tried to be British and steal all of MGMT's synthesizers and play them really badly? Or what if someone had taken a Sufjan Stevens album and replaced all the earnest contemplation with sloppy blending and played out nihilism? As of yet, I'm not sure I can precisely call this Deerhunter's worst album, but it is absolutely the band at their most pretentious and least tolerable. At best, it's stiff and surprisingly indulgent for its brevity, whereas at worst, look, I've been running with the suspicion that Bradford Cox has been pulling a long con on how much music critics will tolerate from him, and he is damn close to the breaking point with me. In short, I didn't like this album. I actually think it's pretty bad. In fact, let's start off with Bradford Cox's stream of consciousness, shall we? Which is the first pass that entirely too many music critics have afforded Deerhunter, because the poetry seems to coalesce, and there's more thematic coherence than even some less ambitious projects and bands. But over the past couple of projects, I have had the suspicion that's partially because Bradford Cox has hit the same depressive, pseudo-nihilistic notes time and time again. And going through this project in particular, it's hard to see all that much is different beyond an awareness that a larger chunk of the rest of the world has finally caught up with him. And man, you could tell he's gonna gloat about it somewhat too. Never directly, as Bradford Cox seems to mostly stick with a strained but not particularly dynamic vocal tone. But as early as the first song, Death in Midsummer, he's telling the audience to humble themselves before the Lord, because everything is dying, has always been dying and fading away, and what are you really gonna do about it? But what gets kind of weird is that you get the impression that now that we're all on that page, Bradford Cox doesn't really know where to take the rest of the album, leading to the utterly jarring and really tone-deaf tribute to the assassinated UK politician Joe Cox and No One's Sleeping, the flailing gestures to elemental forces on, well, Element, and the utterly noxious jabs at current technology and social media on futurism, where the implication is that people, they find comfort in that sort of architecture thanks to fear, and yet he seems to lack the awareness that many people will abandon reason for faith, as he does on the third verse, for a lot of the same reasons. But what's so much more ugly is the framing of all this. Not quite hectoring or snide, but with a shade of brighter earnestness that can't help but feel more smug than it really should, especially in how No One's Sleeping feels so much more like a come to the light moment, and it really is jarring for the content of that song. Now, to be fair, you do kind of get the sense that Bradford Cox might be somewhat self-aware of that, and there is something of an arc to this project, with what happens to people showing the rusted away hypochondria of somebody who refuses connection with all human beings, and later Planes and Nocturne showing the very real possibility of Bradford Cox himself being left behind when people keep moving on and then he starts fading. And you know what? That's actually a thematic interpretation I might be able to buy if it felt that it built anything all that substantiated. This is where the structure comes in, because despite its shorter running time, this album is in no hurry to coalesce or make more of a point or have a lot of momentum, throwing a perfunctory instrumental interlude 3 songs in with Greenpoint Gothic, and then using Détournement a few tracks later as a pitch-down, meandering track where the title might imply an inversion of the narrative, turning one's tactics against oneself, but the song itself is way too diffuse to deliver beyond the token reference, and it's indicative of the larger approach to the album, a base amount of cleverness and some foresight to get to a point, but not really enough to get it to build to more, despite being pleased as punch that he got there in the first place. Take the whole social media observations on futurism. There's nothing profound or original there. Toro y Moi made many of the same observations on outer space, but that album didn't try to take an unconvincing and increasingly ungrounded stance on it. It's actually kind of populist, and I respect that, because when you couple with how abortive and scattered the lyrics on this project feel, look, none of this is all that new, especially coming from Bradford Cox. My patience is just running a lot thinner, and the biggest factor to why that is comes in the production and the instrumentation, where despite feeling like a pretty brief listen, Deerhunter managed to turn in one of their stiffest, clunkiest projects to date, which is saying something considering how much of the inorganic percussion that they had on Fading Frontier. But that's what happens when you pitch electric guitar lines out the window for more harpsichords, mandolins, and some really rickety acoustic pickups, and then choose to mic all the drums to sound so blocky and overblown and clipped. And then there are the synthesizers, be it the ugly keening on Greenpoint Gothic to the thicker, cleaner wells that can't blend with the pitch-shifted vocals on Détournement, from the gummy accent tones on Death in Midsummer, and the really bizarrely up-tempo planes, some of the textured percussion that almost sounds imported from a late-period David Byrne project, all the way to the tepid sputter of Nocturne, where even the vocals sound like they're malfunctioning. And yes, I get that was the point, but it doesn't make it sound any better. Factor in the arranged horns and some of the more lush strings, a healthy dose of reverb where there's no consistency where and when it's applied, whether to the instrumentals or the vocals, and then a pileup of clashing fidelities, and you've got an album that is trying to sound so elegant and stately, but it's got none of the consistent body and polish in order to get there. And what's all the more exasperating is that Deerhunter can still assemble some good melodies, and if they'd been better layered with more consistent tone, some of these songs, they were salvageable. I gotta say that. The instrumental doesn't really match the content on Nobody's Sleeping, but the back half of the song manages to coalesce into a pretty good melodic groove. I do like the outro of that song, and I do think that there's a glittering prettiness to both What Happens to People and Planes that reflects production with a little bit more polish and control, even if the latter song feels just way too short. Hell, Tarmung brings in the chimes, what kind of sounds like a marimba, and a pretty solid arrangement in the low end with some of the strings and horns, but it just feels hollow, lacking the body to really add more and really delivering no emotional impact. But as a whole, look, I know I will be an outlier on this one, because this is exactly the sort of project that mainstream critics love to praise for its connection to the zeitgeist in its content, or its prettier fragments, or even the presumed callbacks to other critically acclaimed acts in indie rock, because you can make those easy comparisons. But nearly all those acts have done these sounds better, and I think that it's very telling that the arc of this album leaves the band sputtering in the past as people will drift away from their brand of nihilism. I will say that there's some poetic irony to it if they didn't have a justifiable reason to leave, because nobody likes to hear "I told you so" if there's no follow-through to build something anew. In other words, if you can't tell, I didn't like this album very much at all across the board, which is why I'm giving it a 4 out of 10 and not a recommendation. Again, if you're a Deerhunter fan, you've probably found something within this group at this point that I just won't. But even you can probably acknowledge this is a far step away from their best, definitely not in the top tier of their discography. Everybody else? Yeah, this band's long past their prime. Like they said, I'd keep moving on. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine I pissed a lot of you off with this review, but hey guys, I tried with this. I gave this a lot of listens, and it just did not coalesce, and again, I've never been a huge fan, and this kind of clinched it. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And I got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Still kind of revamping things over there, but we'll see where things go. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.